So across the studies, particularly among the working class young people we talked to, cold information tended to be viewed with suspicion. It was seen as being produced from the interests of those providing it. So they talked, for instance, about university prospectuses as just advertisements, widening participation initiatives as motivated by money and getting bums on seats, and recruitment drives sometimes as seen as again, businesses' interests. Generally, we did find that careers advisors were often talked about in very negative terms. You'll be shocked. They're described as, for example, not useful or not interested or as uninformed. In contrast, some of the advice provided by some learning mentors and connections personal advisors, where the young people had built up sustained and trusting relationships, was highly valued and was acted upon. But it wasn't just a case of information being provided interpersonally being the key issue. And many young people across the study says, well, it depends who's providing that information. And the extent to which it's seen as relevant for me will, in some respects, be mediated by the extent to which the people providing it are seen as being like me as well. Does it make it just a nice thing, or does it make it something that is actually possible? And in both the social class and higher education and the urban youth studies, we found that young people had been on open days and taster sessions and things like that, and most of them had a really good time. They'd all really liked it. They'd said, university looks wonderful. I understand you can get a better job from it. But at the end of the day, it was still, well, it's not for me. It just looks lovely. I've just learnt about it now and had a nice day out. So it couldn't really interfere with those sort of entrenched social inequalities and cultural discourses that go into forming what makes it as not for me. This also extended in some cases to the use of role models, and for instance, in one of the urban schools we visited for the research, there was we talked to a black Caribbean male teacher and to some of the black working class, black British Caribbean boys that he was allegedly meant to be a mentor to, but actually both sides, there was kind of a gulf of misunderstanding between them. Neither side got where the other was coming from in this particular instance, which was partially related to issues of social class between them. But I think the point I'd like to make is just that the notion of role models alone is not straightforward, and it needs to be quite carefully thought about. So, in terms of identity and cultural discourses, as I've suggested, I think these can profoundly shape the ways in which people see future aspirations as achievable or not for people like me. So obviously identity is key to this. And as an example from the higher education and social class study, for many of the young people we talked to, going to university was associated with a notion of identity change, in particular the idea of becoming middle class or becoming posh. And it was resisted or negotiated on that basis. So, for example, some of the white working class men we talked to resisted the idea of university because they saw it as associated with a loss of identity and a loss of status. They saw higher education as the domain of middle class men, and they associated it with what they saw as an unappealing notion, a version of masculinity, one that they talked about as effeminate and infantilized because it was associated with writing and studying, not grafting, and with financial dependency rather than financial independency. Okay, thanks. So they much preferred to be the idea of wage earners appealed to them much more. And this was picked up in other studies. In the British Chinese study, we also expanded on the notion of identity and drawn Bourdieu's notion of habitus, which is kind of bringing in more of the sense of the individual's life world and the way in which cultural discourses can be part of that. And here we found that even when families lacked particular sort of forms of capital or knowledge, they did a lot of work in other respects to kind of compensate for this. In particular, they drew on these very specific cultural discourses which encouraged high aspirations and high achievement. So there were notions of face and social competition in which, as one young woman put it, it's like a competition among her British Chinese friends and community where they compete for which school you've got into, which higher education institution, and so on, which job area. And this social practice was very much linked to a sense of British Chineseness. They compared other ethnic groups who they described their families as only interested in doing your best with the British Chinese who said, well, our thing is about being the best. And this was quite a powerful form of aspirational discourse. And in the Aspires study as well, we found that cultural discourses, again, can be very powerful. Although we found that across the board at age 10, most children really enjoy science at school, they like doing it, they like their science teachers, and also in our survey, we found that 80% actually do some sort of science-related activities in their spare time for fun. Despite that, we found that very few actually, even at age 10, have science-related aspirations, and a lot of them have ruled it out. So, for instance, Tom, just as an example, was a white middle-class boy. He attended a good school, he had a good teacher, he was achieving really highly in science. His family liked science, his parents were very scientifically literate, they read science books, they went on family outings. Tom did science stuff in his spare time. But even with all the right capitals in place, the family even knew a scientist among their family friends. Even with all that in place, at age 10, both he and his mum said to me in interviews, he's not going to go down the science route. Science is not for him. And that was because the family very much produced itself as an artistic family, and Tom was being produced as a creative and artistic child. And even at age 10, this was placed in opposition to science or creativeness. Okay, thanks. And the final one is structural inequalities. So I'd argue that the need is not necessarily to raise aspirations per se, but to also look at the context within which young people are situated. And we found across the studies that, particularly with the most disadvantaged young people, that they were actually lowering their aspirations over the time in which we tracked them, and they were becoming more gender and class stereotypical. And we'd say that actually a lot of the time they were learning their place, their unequal place in society. We did find examples also of not only the role of capitals in producing inequalities, but also, for example, some teachers still hold lower expectations of minority ethnic pupils and working class pupils. And there's just a quote there from a girl called Loretta, who was basically saying she was told not to bother applying to university by her college teacher because she'd lose the money, it wouldn't be worth it. And we found repeated examples across the study very similar to that. Even among successful quote-unquote groups like the British Chinese, we found that there was a definite steer towards known and safe routes, and this was very much a strategy for managing racism. And so even where parents, for example, a girl called Alice, her mother was a designer. Alice desperately wanted to be a designer, but her mum said, there's too much racism, I've encountered too many problems, don't do it, and I won't pay your university fees if you go down that route. So I'm suggesting that because the role of structural inequalities is vitally important to take account of, and it's not just about aspirations being in the head of the individual, but looking at the individual as socially located. So because I imagine it's time to stop right now, I did have a series of questions which I think might be useful for helping us provoke some further thinking and reflection around the relationship, and I think all the papers are produced and distributed, so I'll just leave them up there and stop in the interest of time. Thank you.